of the life of Samson. Samson, motivated by self-interest. Again, Annette's come up with a nice little graphic to display this. And a lady answered a knock on her door to find a man with a sad expression. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, "but I am collecting money for an unfortunate family in the neighborhood. The husband is out of work, the kids are hungry, the utilities will soon be cut off, and worse, they are going to be kicked out of their apartment if they don't pay the rent this afternoon." "I'll be happy to help," said the woman with a great concern, "but who are you?" "I am the landlord," he replied. And it appears from this illustration that the man was only interested in one thing, and that was collecting the money for himself, from rent from this lady. He doesn't care about that the husband is out of work. He doesn't care that the kids are going hungry. He doesn't care if they're kicked out on the street and no place to live. All he cares about is his own interests as well. In the same sense, we have learned that Samson cares about nothing but in his own self-interest. All that Samson cares about is motivated by his own self-interest. In our last study, Samson had won a great victory at Lehi. Samson had been hiding from the Philistines in the Rock of Edom because he had burned the Philistines' crops and taken revenge on them for what they had done to him. Once the Philistines discovered where he had been hiding or who had burned their crops, they went to burn Samson's wife and his father-in-law. They burned them to death. And after that event, we read that 3,000 men of Judah, his own people, went to the cave where Samson was hiding and to tie him up and to hand him over to the Philistines. Great friends. Well, after they tied him up, as they approached Lehi, the Philistines came shouting at him. And then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson with power, and he broke the ropes that were tied around him like they were nothing. Then he took the jawbone of a donkey, struck down 1,000 Philistines. In other words, he killed 1,000 Philistines. Quite an amazing feat, if you will. And Samson celebrated this victory by naming the place Ramath Lehi, which means Jawbone Hill. He piled them up, like
corn.
Yeah, like a great pile of donkeys, if you will. The name of the place would always remind the people of what Samson had done there. Again, Samson does not do anything without getting recognition for himself. As we continue the story of Samson today, I want to briefly look at verses 8 through 20 in chapter 15, and then move on to chapter 16 and continue on with the story from there. We read in chapter 15, beginning in verse 18, "Because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord, 'You have given your servant this great victory. Must I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?' Then God opened up the hollow in a hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength was returned, and he revived. So the spring was called En-Hakkore, and it is still there in Lehi. Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines." Now in these verses, we first read that Samson calls on the Lord. He calls on the Lord. First of all, let me say that many of the commentaries commend Samson in these verses because he calls on God. And I have to disagree with all of them.
Yep.
Every one of them, except for one. I have one that follows the same line of thinking that I have been following the whole time. But if you study these verses carefully, you find out that Samson is doing nothing but ranting at God. And I would not recommend that you talk or pray to God in the way Samson does in these verses here.
Never.
Never. In verse 18, we read that Samson has become thirsty after his great victory over 1,000 Philistines. The reference to Samson becoming thirsty is kind of unexpected. And I say that because there's no doubt that the slaughter of the Philistines with the jawbone was an extraordinary achievement and may have taken its toll on him physically, but all of his other victories have left us with the impression that Samson has been empowered by God, by the Spirit of God, allowing him all these victories without much effort. Yeah.
True.
Why are we told that Samson is thirsty? It's kind of an interesting question, really.
Right.
I mean, well, from these verses we learn that for a moment Samson is at his strongest, and next he is at his weakest point. In one moment of his life is a reflection of the divine or God in him, but in the next moment he is quickly made aware that he is only a man. Yeah, I mean, he has superhuman strength, right? And for all indications of reading, you would think he's Superman. He never gets tired. Samson was quickly reminded of his humanity. Samson is physically and emotionally drained. One writer says the reason why Samson was thirsty was because God was reminding him that without God's Spirit, he was nothing. And it really relates to us today. Without God in our lives today, we're really nothing. We have no power to do the work that God has called us to do. None at all. Notice that this also is the first time that Samson calls or prays on God. In all of our studies so far, he has never called on God. Never acknowledged God in his life at all, has he? No other time in our study have we seen or heard him calling out to God, but it is clear that his prayer to God is only due to his exhaustion from the massacre of the Philistines. Again, you get the point that Samson's just thinking about himself.
Yep.
Yeah? Right? Now, again, many of the commentaries, commend Samson for his prayer. Next, we see that Samson acknowledges the Lord's deliverance. We see that Samson says, "You have given your servant this great victory." At first, Samson's prayer seems pretty sincere. We want to applaud Samson for finally recognizing his dependence on God, but his prayer is as narcissistic as his manner of life has been all up to this point. In this verse, Samson acknowledges the source of his strength. He realizes that God has given him the victory of the Philistines. Secondly, he acknowledges that the source of his service. He acknowledges that he is a servant of God. But Samson calling himself a servant of God is quite laughable if you want to get technical about it, right? If you want to get serious. He has never considered himself that way before. At every point in his life, he has disobeyed God and violated his Nazirite vows that he is supposed to observe. We have seen from his actions and antics that he has not acted in any way, shape, or form as a servant of God. But that doesn't stop him from calling himself a servant of God. Maybe he doesn't think he's done anything wrong in the eyes of God. But everything that he's done has been wrong, hasn't it? Now notice the reasons why Samson called on God. Samson says, "Must I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" The reason why Samson cries out to God is because of a personal crisis in his own life. How many times do people do that? They don't want anything to do with God until it's, something hits them personally. Some kind of crisis, right? Many people do that. Don't want anything to do with God until you need Him. And that's the way Samson is. He is thirsty. That's the reason why he cries out. He is worried about dying because of his thirst. But he's also concerned about falling into the hands of the Philistines. He calls the Philistines the uncircumcised. And again, this is a pejorative comment, a belittling comment. Why all of a sudden is Samson concerned about defilement and ritual issues? Why? He didn't seem to care about being ritually unclean when he went and looked for a woman in the town of Timnah. He didn't care about going to a Philistine town. He didn't care about eating the honey from the carcass of a lion. He didn't worry about killing the lion. He never worried about any of that. Nor did he protest when his parents objected to him marrying one of the uncircumcised people. Again, Samson's motives are entirely selfish. Even in this prayer. The New American Commentary says this: several features in Samson's prayer suggest that he perceives himself as the second Moses. First, it is the thirst that motivates him to cry out to God. Second, he interprets his role as that of a Savior through whom Yahweh, God, has given deliverance. Thirdly, recalling the title ascribed to Moses, he refers to himself as a servant. Again, Samson is really quite the character, isn't he? Far from displaying any concern about the fate of his own people or the work that is yet to be done, or any concern about God's glory whatsoever, his intention in his prayer is purely personal. Cares about nobody. I think that song we just sang, he's not heavy, he's my brother. Well, Samson didn't care about his brother.
Right.
He doesn't care about anybody. It's about himself. He wants to avert his own death and to avoid capture by the Philistines. Now we read about Samson's restoration in verse 19. Then God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned to him, and he revived. This verse tells us that God miraculously provides Samson with water. In reading this verse, we are amazed at the fact that God even answers his prayer. I don't know if I was God, I'm thinking, wow, you can act like that. I don't have anything to do with you. You only call on me when you need something. In spite of Samson's sinful actions, God still provides Samson with what he needs. And after Samson drank the water, his strength returned, and he was revived. I think that's, a gracious God, don't you think?
Oh, yes.
A gracious God. God will provide. Even when you have been sinful. Even when you have resisted his call and done what he's asked you to do, God is gracious. He still loves you. He still cares. He doesn't want anybody to perish.